It's great to be with you once more, and I'm assuming the fact that you all came back means the first lecture went fairly well. I like to hope. But no, I enjoy I enjoy traveling, getting out, and meeting with Christian brothers and sisters all around the world, because you find that there are some things that are very similar, some things which are transferable, translatable, and then everyone else has their own sort of the niche things, the local things that they're wrestling with. So there's always the universal and the particular in every Christian context. And it's always good to enjoy fellowship with men and women who love Jesus and love those who are followers of Jesus all around the world. And I really enjoyed the fellowship and warmth I've had amongst the people, even if the climate was less hospitable than what I'm used to. But anyway, we're continuing our talks on church and state, which has always been a contested topic, literally since, I guess, from when Paul wrote Romans 13, or actually even before that, when the apostles were in Jerusalem, or even before that, when Jesus was crucified by a Roman governor. So in the previous lecture, we looked at some of the debates about church and state, and whether does Christianity have an anti-imperial ethos in it, particularly in Paul's expression in Romans. And we noted, maybe with some qualifications, that it does. But one thing I neglected to say, you could actually argue that the anti-imperial ethos of Christianity is very much inherited from the Jewish tradition, because in the Old Testament, there is a lot about how do God's people relate to kings and even to foreign powers, whether that's Pharaoh or the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and there you find quite a mixed array of images as well. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians are definitely the bad guy. But one very interesting thing, I don't know whether you noticed, the Persians are always treated positively. From the moment Cyrus set the Judeans in Babylon free, the Judeans generally seem to thrive under the freedoms of the Persian Empire. So even though they were under a foreign empire, they had a certain degree of autonomy and complete religious freedom that the prophets, for the most part, were quite happy to live with and to live under. Now, obviously, that meant that the glorious hopes for the restoration of Israel, a Messiah, a new temple, a great sort of blessings, fecundity, or the return of the peoples back to Judea, that had not yet happened. But the Persian Empire is very positive. And then it's when you get the Greeks and the Romans that you see the heightening of the antagonistic or volatile relationship between Israel and pagan powers. And you could probably say in the book of Daniel, particularly, chapter 2, chapter 7, is when you really see the height of that in the Old Testament. So I probably should have emphasized the Jewish roots of Paul's anti-imperial ethos we find in Romans. But that's empires of days of old. What about the empires of our own time? When the news broke in 1945 that the Japanese Empire had surrendered after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one of the leaders of the Allies wrote in his journal the words of Psalm 9:5, which says, "You have rebuked the nations, you have destroyed the wicked, you have blotted out their name forever and ever." The leader who quoted that passage of Scripture was definitely not Joseph Stalin. It was not even the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, nor the Free French General Charles de Gaulle, not even the American President Harry S. Truman. The leader on the Allied side who quoted those words of Psalm 9 on hearing of the Japanese surrender was none other than the Chinese nationalist leader, Chiang Kai-shek. He led a loose coalition of different groups, warlords and guerrilla fighters against the Japanese occupation. Chiang Kai-shek is an interesting guy. He was converted as a Methodist, and he really came to faith at one point when he was arrested by his own troops, and they were his own generals deciding whether they wanted to keep him in charge of the fight against the Japanese or not. Now, he was somewhat more eclectic in his religious beliefs between Methodism and Confucianism, but he was a Christian of sorts. Our time is a time where we live in the shadow of empires new and fallen. I was born in a country that no longer exists. No, that's not Atlantis. I'm not that old. It's not Narnia either. I'm not that real. I was born in West Germany. West Germany was a country that existed because of the Second World War, because of the Prussian Federation that created Germany. So the very place where, and I was there because my father was part of the British occupying forces. So, my very birth is a feature of empire. The only reason I grew up in Australia is because the British in their empire colonized Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the world, including Canada. So my birth, where I grew up, where we currently are now, is very much rooted in the empires of the world. And the churches in every age have had to wrestle with the empire. Now, how we relate to the British Empire, well, I like to think the King Chuck, as his friendly subjects call him, King Chucky III, is quite content for us to have our autonomous rule of law and our own elected leaders, with him to be a mere somewhat figurehead of a monarch, if you like. But in other places, the reality of new and emerging empires is a real thing. And recently, in the last few years, I've spoken to leaders in seminaries in Taiwan and in Ukraine, where the realities of changing borders and empires and real or the prospect of invasion is something that is on their doorstep or in their face right now. I don't know whether you noticed, but we live in a time of immense geopolitical turmoil. From the global financial crisis in 2008, we've had various things happening in Afghanistan. The Ukraine-Russia war really began in 2014 and and came to a precipice a couple of years ago. We've got currently the crisis in Israel, Gaza. You've got the increasing nationalism in places in some parts of Europe as well as in India. We've had the pandemic. Financial problems still seem to plague the world. In addition, you've got a climate situation we're constantly dealing with. The world is one of the most precarious states, I feel, since the 1930s. To me, the world seems very combustible, as if it just takes, the First World War, just takes one Serbian peasant assassinating one archduke, and it feels like the entire world is going to catch on fire. And we've got to think about what that means for us in this highly volatile situation, when the world is becoming increasingly divided between an axis of autocracies and a looser democratic alliances. We've got to think about how we relate to the governing authorities, both here and abroad. What does the practice of Christian faith require of us to act towards the government, whether we're living in China or Pakistan or Venezuela, Finland, America, or Canada? And I guess the first thing we want to know is how do we posture ourselves towards the state? Should we be genuinely affirmative, or should we always have a little bit of suspicion towards the state? Now, the posture of Christians towards the state actually oscillates in the New Testament. Sometimes Christians are very kind of warmly favored towards the state. Other times they're a little bit more suspicious and hostile. I mean, let me give you a few examples. In the book of Acts, we're told that the apostles were standing in favor with all the people. Paul, writing to the Romans, said, all government, even the Roman Empire, is appointed by God to administer justice and deserves our obedience. Similarly, Paul instructed the believers in Asia Minor also to be subordinate and submissive to human authorities. At one point, Paul even appealed to Caesar to get him off when he'd been accused of various crimes, presumably because he thought Caesar may well give him a fair hearing. But on the other hand, we can also see a negative relationship between Jesus and his followers and the state authorities. I mean, for the start, Jesus was crucified by a callous Roman governor at the behest of the Jerusalem high priests. When the Sanhedrin ordered the apostles to stop preaching about Jesus, they declined on the ground that we must obey God, not human beings. Paul and Peter, according to tradition, were both martyred in Rome during Nero's persecution of the Roman churches. And while persecution of Christians in antiquity was more localized and spasmodic, there were many places, many times, when it was an imperial-wide policy to execute Christians, confiscate their policy, and burn their sacred books. No wonder then that John of Patmos could describe the Roman Empire as a monster rising out of the sea, filled with blasphemies and brutalities, salivating with greed. And John was praying, hoping for the day where the monster and its worshippers would be destroyed by divine judgment. So here's the kind of tension we live between. On the one hand, there's Romans 13, which says, government is appointed by God, therefore we should submit to governing authority. And then we have Revelation 13, where we pray that God destroys the whole thing and throws it into the deity's dumpster of destruction. There are those days. And for us, the temptation is, when there's the political party we like is in power, then we become Romans 13 people. And then when the party we don't like is in power, then we become Revelation 13 people. So we're both dealing with the number 13 here, but the one you gravitate towards will depend on your own political inclinations as they are expressed in government. But let's assume for a moment we're living in a context where it's perhaps a little bit more Revelation 13 than it is Romans 13, where we see a government that does not respect the rule of law, that does not treat us with equality before the law, does not respect religious freedom or human rights. Is it okay to disobey? And again, the obvious text we have to wrestle with, and I think we'll keep coming back to this time and time again, is Romans 13, where Paul says, every person must be subject to ruling authorities. There is no authority, you see, except from God, and those that exist have been put in place by God. As a result, anyone who rebels against authority is resisting what God has set up, and those who resist will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terrors for people who do good, but only for people who do evil. How do we disobey state authorities when Paul told us, plain as day, that they should be obeyed because they're divine servants appointed by God? And again, the problem with this text is not its opaqueness. It's the opposite. The problem is its clarity. It's unqualified call for obedience to governing authorities. They're to be obeyed because they are appointed by God. In 1 Peter chapter 2, we find something similar, although it does begin to introduce some qualifications. Peter stressed that Christians should be subject to every human institution for the sake of the Lord, whether to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish evildoers and praise those who do good. Such is God's will and extends even to giving honor to the emperor. Much like Romans 13, in 1 Peter 2, there is also a call for submission and paying respect to governing authorities. But there are some very, very subtle differences. Notice that government is called human, not divine. These are human or earthly authorities, which means they should not be usurping for themselves divine prerogatives. And that would mean doing things like demanding cultic or worship for themselves. Christians are to respect them as free people and slaves of God, not slaves of the governing authorities. Christians render honor, not worship, to the emperor. Now, nothing here in 1 Peter 2 would require Christians to make sacrifices to the Roman gods or to offer a pinch of incense to the genius of the emperor or to, offer a sacrifice to some household spirits or something like that. And certainly the inclination of believers is to submit to governing authorities, to give respect say yes, sir, thank you, sir, or ma'am, or whatever the occasion may be. And by living exemplary lives of service, it is a service not only to the emperor, but to God. I was reading a book written in the 1990s that said at one point, this will sound bad now, but Syria was the place in the Middle East where Christians felt the safest. It wasn't Turkey, wasn't Lebanon, wasn't Israel or Egypt. In Syria, they had a lot of confidence in the Assad regime that things were going well. Now, the plight of Christians in Syria has well and truly changed due to the civil war. But again, Christians were able to submit to governing authorities because, at least for a long time, Syria was one of the safest places in the Middle East for Christians. So it has a lot of wisdom in this. Working with the governing authorities, not making a nuisance of yourself, and receiving in turn the ability to live as good citizens and have the freedom to practice and promote your faith. Nevertheless, comments Tom Schreiner in his commentary, if governments prescribe what is evil or demand that believers refuse to worship God, then believers as slaves of God must refuse to obey. And this is what we've got to remember, that the exhortations we find in Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, these are a general principle, not a rule that will apply in every single situation where government exists. This seems to assume that government is operating in its best expression, or in a way, at least, is what we might call near just. Okay, so it's a relatively good quality government. And that was something that you'll find in a lot of ancient political philosophers. Plato, Aristotle, you'll find it in various Jewish writings like the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach. Good government is a blessing from God. Even if you don't agree 100% with everything, good government is from the people and it's appointed by God. But what if government requires Christians to do things contrary to their religious convictions? Like offer a sacrifice to the image of Nebuchadnezzar, or bow down and worship an image of the Emperor Domitian. Or if the government tries to compel us to affirm or to do something our consciences will not allow us. Now, John Calvin was very aware of this problem. He knew there were Protestant subjects in various, Catholic kingdoms. And he addressed this. He said, obedience to the state is never to lead us away from obedience to God. If they command anything against him, let it go unesteemed. When the princes forbid the services and worship of God, when they command their subjects to pollute themselves with idolatry and want them to consent to and participate in all the abominations that are contrary to the service of God, they are not worthy to be regarded as princes, nor to have authority attributed to them. Now, in this context, what Calvin is worried about is basically a Catholic king, queen, or prince would order Protestants to worship according to the Catholic tradition, Catholic liturgies and right. That's kind of what Calvin was really worried about. And he makes a point, when you are given those commands, he says, well, just ignore them and disobey and let the consequences fall where they may. So Calvin knew that there were some situations in which you could disobey the government if it was trying to regulate your worship or trying to force you to worship in one particular way. And Calvin's point needs to be rethought, though, in light of our own day, where we can face versions of secularism that are predatory rather than benign, or even pernicious paganisms in our own day. Suffice to say, Calvin was aware that obedience to the state was never total or unqualified. So, is it possible for a Christian to obey the state? The answer is yes. And that's because, first, no earthly authority, whether a monarch or a magistrate, president or prime minister, nobody possesses absolute authority. The state's authority is derivative from God. They are appointed by God to rule. So states only have instrumental authority, not ultimate authority. Also, the authority of the state is not an inviolable position, but a performance of service. A service for which it's been appointed to God, and a service which it renders to God and for the benefit of its own peoples. government's authority is conditional on its performance to meet God's standards of righteousness and to win the consent of the people so governed. So that's the first thing to remember. No government authority is absolute. Second, while government is divinely instituted for the common good and to administer justice, it should be obeyed in principle. Not every governor is good. So, the idea, the concept of government is a good thing. You could even call it a part of common grace, necessary wherever human beings form societies. The goodness of government does not mean every governor is good. Government should not be obeyed in every instance, especially if it interferes with religious liberty, acts unlawfully, or renders harm to its own people, or potentially even to other people. We might say that God does bring order through government, and he wants every aspect of human societies to be governed wisely through legitimate authorities. But there can be a point where Christians have to say to state authorities and state actors, we must obey God rather than human beings. Now, there could be a number of instances where we could talk about that. I won't go into a number of details. I'll just tell you one example from Australia. About mid last year, we have what's called the Australian Capital Territory Government, which is it's kind of like similar to the area around Ottawa. And they did an audit of their health system, and they discovered, to their shock and surprise, that there is a Catholic hospital that does not perform abortions or do euthanasia. And they regarded this as deeply troubling and problematic because they're a very, very progressive government. And about a month after this review, they announced that they were seizing control of the hospital and taking it over under the facade of a rationalisation of health services in the territory, but it was really seizing control of a Catholic hospital because, to be quite frank, they don't like Catholics. And they passed legislation. It was kind of chilling because it included permission for the police to use a, quote, reasonable force if the Catholics resist the seizure of the hospital. Okay, I found that quite chilling. Now, there was a kind of an appeal against the decision, but the Catholic lost. The Catholic Church in the ACT lost, and they took control of the hospital. And the very first thing they did, I think they took control on a Friday. On the Sunday, paying tradesmen, double time. Well, the first thing they did was they took down the cross off the Catholic hospital. It looked like a scene from China, where the Chinese government removes crosses from buildings or demolishes churches. It looked exactly like that. It would have been quite legitimate for Catholics, I believe, to barricade the hospital or to form a chain around the hospital or the cross and to resist what was clearly a punitive action against a religious group who were being attacked because of their beliefs, because effectively they would not kill on behalf of the state. That would be a good example of civil disobedience. Fortunately, for reasons I don't know, I'm not privy to, the Catholics, despite launching a legal appeal which failed, decided not to pursue any further with any sort of protest or action. But I believe that would have been a moment of putting up some degree of resistance. But then there's a further question we have to ask. So generally you said, obeying government's good. But if government goes really, really bad, then we do have that kind of, we switch from Romans 13, we flip over to Revelation 13, and we say, we must obey God rather than human beings. But here's the question. How far can we go in our civil disobedience? Can our civil disobedience become uncivil? This was a question that's been faced by Christians throughout the centuries. What if the government does harm or evil to their own people? Now, on this topic, while Calvin said, look, if some prince tries to force you to attend mass, just ignore him. But if the king or the prince is violent, a thug starts arresting people or executing people, what should you do about it? And here, Calvin was very reluctant to go down the path of insurrection or violence. Listen to what Calvin said. Calvin said, if we are cruelly tormented by a savage prince, if we are greedily despoiled by one who is avaricious or wanton, or if we are neglected by a slothful one, if finally we are vexed for piety's sake by one who is impious and sacrilegious, let us then call this thought to mind, that it is not for us to remedy such evils, that only this remains, to implore the Lord's help, in whose hand are the hearts of kings and the changing of kingdoms. Calvin's response is, in the face of tyranny, pray hard and hope for the best. That's the best you can do. That's what Calvin says. He was very reluctant to endorse any type of revolution or any type of counter coup or a kind of, free Geneva now kind of liberation movement. But how do you do that when you're facing more extreme groups than cranky European princes, people who declare your very existence is illegal? Must we suffer tyranny with no recourse to passive or even active defense? Now, this is a topic that, again, certainly after the Reformation, Christians have thought long and hard about. There is a long tradition of being allergic to regicide. Okay, just because the king is tyrannical, lazy, or greedy, that's no reasons to kill him. And one verse that was very important was 2 Samuel 16. It's the story where you've got Saul, who's called in the Old King James a man of blood. So he's a man who sheds a lot of blood. But even David, when he had the chance, did not kill him. And that story was one of the most important ones that shaped a lot of believers during the Middle Ages and even through the Reformation period, on the grounds that, it's up to God to get rid of them. God appoints government, God can get rid of them. So that story about David, not killing Saul in that cave when he had the chance was very important. Because they say, look, God raises up all sorts of people. Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus, Darius, Caesars, Justin Trudeau. God can raise up a number of people who are not always friendly disposed to Christians. And Christians simply should endure it with patience and prayer. But not everybody was happy with that option. There were many Christians who thought, well, you've got 2 Samuel 16, but what about a bit of Roman history? What about Brutus? Remember when Brutus took down Caesar? There's something attractive about that. And during the English Reformation, a number of Puritans rallied against King Charles I of England, and they did want to go the route of insurrection. And many argued, based on biblical principles, that it was desirous and even dutiful to actively and violently resist an illegitimate government, a government that had made themselves, by their tyranny, by their evil, their enemy of both God and God's people. Now, there was a little bit of a precedent for this. Some people were thinking about, well, what do you do with a bad monarch? I mean, there were people quoting 2 Samuel 16, but someone like Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, he said, okay, look, Romans 13 says we have to obey God, but if push comes to shove, maybe you can get rid of a king or a prince if he's attained his office by violent usurpation. So if there's a king who killed the previous king, maybe it's legitimate to get rid of him. Or else if he's violent and tyrannical towards his own people. But Aquinas' qualification was he shouldn't be removed by private persons, so there's no kind of lone wolf assassins. Aquinas said you need like a public authority, like a senate or a council of nobles. So the unrighteous, the illegitimate king is at least removed by a legitimate authority. Others did not take that track, and they just said, get rid of this bad king and put his head on a platter. Samuel Rutherford's 17th century tract Lex Rex, which means, the law is king, said that Christians do not have to offer unqualified and absolute obedience to oppressive governments. And Rutherford gave what you might call a theopolitical reading of Romans 13, and he argued that resistance, even violent resistance to tyrannical rule, was warranted to preserve the freedom of the people, hence the execution of Charles I. Now, these debates over Romans 13, 1 Peter 2, they take on frenzied intensity in the United States during the War of Independence, where the pro-British people are quoting Revelation 13, and the continental forces, their preachers and chaplains, are saying, yeah, but does Romans really 13? I mean, regulating the price of tea. I mean, what tyranny can we live with people telling us how much we're going to charge for our tea? Can we really bear the burden of this? So the American War of Independence, or me as a British citizen, I call it the pouting of insurrection by a bunch of no-good Nick Americans. I only said that because I'm in Canada. 100 miles south of the border, I didn't use that language. Not without a big exit out the back. But yeah, during the American Revolution, and also during the American Civil War, there were massive debates about Romans 13. And yeah, you had loyalist clergy saying, respect the king, his governing authorities. And others were saying, well, sic semper tyrannis, down with the tyrant and the like. And again, you can find speeches by the President of the American Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, which is all about resisting tyranny, resisting tyrannical government and the like. So are Christians able to take up arms, to use weapons, violence, terrorism against a governing authority that is tyrannical towards them or to the people in general? Here I think I need to give you two case studies of this. I don't know whether you know anything about the Mexican Revolution, but in the final stages of the Mexican Revolution in the 1920s, there was a lot of oppression of the Catholic Church. You might say very similar to what's going in Nicaragua today. And as a result of the oppression of the Catholic Church, where there were like 5,000 priests were executed, priests were banned from voting, priests were banned from wearing their clerical attire in public. There was all sorts of, confiscation of properties and the like. During that time, there was what is called the Cristero Rebellion, where Catholic peasants took up arms against the Calais regime, which the regime wanted either to suppress Catholicism or wipe it out altogether. Now, the Cristeros were moderately successful against federal troops. And they were able to apply enough pressure, and this was coming from other places as well, eventually to win something of an amnesty, or to get a peace where the Catholic Church would be no longer persecuted, or the anti-Catholic laws would no longer be enforced. Although you could put forward the case that the Cristeros didn't actually need their violence to get those concessions, and maybe they would have happened anyway. Another example we can look is what happened in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s and the 1990s, and how Christians were involved in bringing down communism in Eastern Europe. John Paul II, who was the Pope from 1978 to 2005, he was very important for bringing down communism, particularly in Poland. When he was Bishop of Krakow in Poland, the Polish Communist Party regarded him as a harmless and non-ideological cleric. So they didn't have too many. They didn't think he was going to cause too much problems for them when he became Pope. But when he did become Pope, John Paul II was a big supporter of the Solidarity movement, which supported the slow but sure eradication or defeat of the Communist Party, principally in Poland, but also in Europe as well. Now, yes, there were other geopolitical factors going on around the world as well, but Pope John Paul, the Catholic Church, were very instrumental in bringing down communism in Poland. In fact, there was one famous scene where all these people had come out to an open-air service that John Paul was presiding at, and there was also one of the Communist Party leaders there, and the crowd were chanting, "We want God, we want God." The Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc were not defeated by violence, not by tanks, Tomahawk missiles, or submarine. They were defeated simply by the church winning over the support or helping the people in suppressed countries achieve their aspirations and dreams of freedom and dignity. Or to quote one Catholic document, they won their freedom not by violence but by trying every avenue of negotiation, dialogue and witness to the truth, appealing to the conscience of the adversary and seeking to reawaken in him a shared sense of human dignity. And you could argue that on the whole, peaceful resistant movements tend to be more successful than violent resistant movements. And we can refer to not just John Paul II, we could talk about the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the Christmas Revolution in Romania. We could look at Martin Luther King, Gandhi and countless others. Peaceful resistant movements tend to be far more successful than violent ones. And even to consider the prospect of violence as permissible, I mean, it's to enter into a very morally fraught space. Once you justify one type of violence, the temptation is always going to be to justify further violence. And violence will merely multiply violence. Jesus told us not to take an eye for an eye. When someone hits you on the right cheek, turn the other one towards him as well. Paul said, do not repay evil for evil, because in many senses to resist evil with evil will to create more evil and an increasing and intensifying spiral of evil. Now, Christians have been able to survive and even thrive under all sorts of governments: monarchies, oligarchies, dictatorships, sultanates, liberal democracies, tribal confederations, and doing that without resorting to violence. And I would want to claim that any civil resistance needs to be proportionate and have a criterion between distinguishing between lawful and unlawful state authorities. And as I've already said, the risk remains that to resist violence with more violence will simply make the spiral go even further. And I think we could also make the case that civil resistance to unjust or tyrannical authority need not be violent, it only need be subversive. I remember hearing the story of an official saying he was being interviewed, and he said, this communist official said to him, "You owe the government your respect. You owe them your obedience." And this pastor said, "Oh yes, I agree. They deserve our respect, our obedience, and they deserve that. And I, for one, want to see this government get everything it deserves." You've got to find ways of being subversive. We don't need to be violent, we just need to be subversive. And that is disrupt, deter, and destroy, in some cases, civil government's ability to extend its unjust authority and power. I will offer a minority report here, though. I can say that the path of non-violent resistance is better because I myself have never suffered the violence of a totalitarian regime. The state government in Victoria is not one I would consider friendly. That's why the nickname for Melbourne is often Melbourne Grad. But it's not exactly the former Premier Daniel Andrews. He's nothing like Nero, even at his worst. Nothing. So while we may have civil resistance on some aspects, or we may challenge and question government policies and legislation on others, nothing has even remotely warranted the need for uncivil disobedience. But what about those places where they do experience violence? You know, what if you're dealing with a megalomaniac like Nero, living under Nazis in Nuremberg? I mean, would you assassinate Hitler if you had the chance? That's the old-time question. What about a Hindu extremist government in Nagpur, or when Islamic terrorists take over a town like Najaf? The Kenyan Anglican Archbishop David Gitari said this: "Taking up arms to fight an autocratic regime should only be done when all other measures of bringing the desired political change have failed." Now, what's interesting we can note is that in Kenya in the 1950s, the British engaged in what is now known as the Mau Mau suppression, where a group of Kenyans were rising up against the British colonial power, and the British in turn reacted, you might say overreacted, with due force and killed thousands and thousands of men, women and children. But most of the time, violence and revolution are not the answer. We must allow peaceful non-violence to be the norm to our opposition and resistance to tyranny and injustice. But if we look around the world now, what are the type of regimes, the governments that we should be resisting? And if you want to know that, you'll have to come back tomorrow. Thank you. So I think, we've got some time for questions and a roving mic.
You made an interesting distinction between, thanks for the lecture, by the way, between the government and the governors. Would that be something that would be recognized in Paul's day in a Roman context, or is that a more modern idea?
Yeah, well, you could say that the idea of government is divinely instituted, but not every governor or every regime is necessarily a good government. And I mean, this is where John Wycliffe said something interesting. He said, if God appoints bad governors, that would mean God is the author of evil. And so John Wycliffe saw that as a kind of a get around to Romans 13. He says, God appoints good government, he doesn't appoint bad government. Because if he did, then he'd be responsible for evil. So God's only appointing good governors, and if they're not good governors, they're not appointed by God, then we can get rid of them. That was John Wycliffe's view. Because I think he quotes something from, I think it's a quote from like Proverbs, like they made kings but not from me. And he used that as like when the people appointed their own ruler without respect. He used that verse as his justification. Because a lot of it's often hinged on these, like, man of blood, and, even David didn't kill him, or, they made kings but not for me. He used that as the justification for rising up against bad rulers.
Well, thanks again for the lecture. It was great. I have two questions, if you allow me. So first, to talk about the difference of like the people who leans towards Romans 13 and Revelation 13. And I was thinking, like, you mentioned when the apostle says we must obey God rather than men. And they were dealing with Jewish authorities, right?
Yep.
And there is a difference, seems like, in the way they would deal with like Jewish authorities and like Roman authorities when you see Paul dealing with them. Because like they had different concepts of who God is and how the relationship of the government with God. And even the Old Testament, the prophets, they have a certain relationship with their own authorities, and with the pagans nations, it's a different thing. You see this difference, and you think it transposes to what we have today. Like if you have like a Christian nation, or a nation who is based like in Christian values, and a more pagan nation.
Well, I don't know. Some Christian nations today can be pretty pagan in some ways, if you ask me. So that line is becoming a lot thinner, if you ask me. I don't think there's a big difference between whether it's Jewish or whether it's Greek or Roman or Syrian or Egyptian. That's never made the point of it. It's all government is appointed to govern wisely, and insofar as it does, it should be obeyed, whether it's Jewish, Greek, Roman, or whatever. On should we have a different attitude towards Christian government? I don't think so. Certainly during the British English Civil War, the American War of Independence, and the American Civil War, it very much was Christians versus Christians, and even a lot of wars. And this is why we had the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was about we've got to stop doing this. Protestants versus Catholics. We can't keep going on like this. We've got to find a way, and that's where you get the invention of secularism, effectively. So I don't think it matters that much on the ethno-religious identity of the government. Government is good. What's funny is that there are some Christians who prefer to live under Islamic governments. Like the Jews escaped Catholic Spain and they went to the Ottoman Empire because it was more tolerant under the Ottomans. In the early decades of the Arab conquest of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, a lot of monophysites fought with the Muslim Arabs against the Byzantine Empire because the Arabs gave them more religious tolerance than what the Byzantine Empire did. I mean, this is maybe a little bit baffling to us, but so a lot of Christians found it a lot more tolerable under Muslim rule. And again, you could look about Christians. Christians would rather live under Assad's regime than in Israel, or even in Christian Lebanon. There's a lot of places where Christians have done a lot better. So I don't think the ethno-religious composition of the government will necessarily make a lot of difference. You can have good Muslim government. Jordan is a relatively Christian-friendly country as well these days. So yeah.
Yeah, just a second question is about one thing I find hard, like sometimes applying Romans 13 more than interpreting it. Like you can see during that time, like the understanding when it says, talks about governing authorities and you have an emperor. But today we live in democracy, at least for now here. And like the prime minister is not a king or an emperor. So
does he know that?
Hopefully.
Sorry. Freudian slip, mate.
So how would you bridge the gap between like how Paul's understanding of like what the governing authority is and how our understanding should be today, and how like Justin Trudeau in this case should be submitting to the population, or what's the Canadian Constitution or something like that, which should be above him, right?
Yeah, well, democracies can be bad government. You may have noticed in the last 50 or so years. A good example is Socrates was executed by a democracy. The Athenian democracy put Socrates to death on a religious crime of corrupting the youth with foreign deities or teaching superstitions and the like. Democracies can do bad things. You can look at the democracies, even of the West, how they've done things in other parts of the world. Not just colonialism, but very exploitive and violent. Initially I was a supporter of the second Iraq war, because I thought, okay, yeah, look, post 9/11, getting rid of dictators in the world would be a good idea. They'll make the world a better place. We were told that it was about weapons of mass destruction, and there was an imminent plan to attack Israel and attack America, and it was a load of baloney. So and Australia, I think, and Canada, but all went along with that. And in hindsight, it was a bad idea, and the consequences were terrible because we got rid of one monster and a bigger monster arose in his place. So even democracies can do bad things. Now, ideally, and this is both the difference between a liberal democracy and a simple democracy. Like Indonesia and India and Turkey and even Iran are democracies in a sense. Their government are elected by people, but they're not liberal democracies. They don't err on basic freedom of the people. And this thing we have to remember, that we are not democracy of the mob. We can't simply take a vote and decide we want to execute all the Jews, because we are a constitutional democracy. And one of the purposes of the Constitution, well, two purposes. One is to put checks, balance, and limits on federal and state power. And the other thing a constitution does is protect minorities from the majority. Now, when those constitutional protections are obeyed, I think you can have generally good government. And I will probably argue, I think I argue later, that liberal democracy is a explicitly Christian project. And the proof of that is liberal democracy only springs and lasts in countries largely with a Protestant Christian heritage. Okay, but that's what I'll be arguing in subsequent lectures.
Someone else? Question?
Was anyone looking for a license for any political assassinations? They've been mulling over and toing and froing. Yes. Who would you like to assassinate? No.
and just of the intellectual variety.
Yeah.
You distinguish between violent and nonviolent resistance, and you're opposed to violent, but certain forms of nonviolent resistance seem acceptable to you.
Yeah.
But of course, there's various types of nonviolent resistance.
Yep.
You might say that there's just praying and holding candles on the one hand,
Yep.
but what about something, let's say, the majority of the population refusing to pay their taxes?
Yep.
After a period of time, hospitals would start to collapse, roads would not be monitored, et cetera, et cetera. Would you be in favor of that kind of nonviolent resistance or not?
You have to weigh it up. You have to weigh it up. It has to be proportionate. If say the government is doing something terrible, like putting a toll on the road, like when you go through, you have like road tolls, like a little beeper on your car, and you might say, well, this tyranny of taxation's got to go, and therefore I'm going to get all of Canada to stop paying any of our taxes. I mean, I think they would say that's probably disproportionate. Okay, I think that would be disproportionate. But if a government was doing something like, let me give you an example. In the Solomon Islands, you've got a government there that's now been captured by the Chinese Communist Party, and they're effectively being bribed, and they're now in the pocket of the Chinese Communist Party. And the Prime Minister of the Solomon Islands, whose name is Sogavare, has said, look, we've got a bit of a budget problem. We're hosting the Pan-Pacific Games, and we're meant to be holding a federal election for the Solomon Islands, and we can't really afford to do both, and I know you people love your sports. So what we're going to do, we'll have the Pan-Pacific Games hosted in the Solomon Islands, and later, when we get back in the black, we'll have an election. Okay, that's currently what's happening in the Solomon Islands. They're basically cancelling an election, and the guy's able to get away with it because he's getting a lot of Chinese money to bribe all the MPs to go along with it. That's effectively what's happening. In that context, I think, no, I'm not going to pay taxes to this government. And so I think that would be a proportionate response to what is a nakedly undemocratic government beginning to even act in despotic ways.
Go Randy.
So just furthering that conversation a little, but how does that weigh against what you were saying earlier about Romans 13? So bringing it back to that, logically, I understand your argument for that being a proportionate response. Makes sense logically. Now, theologically, where does that weigh it? How does that tip the balance?
Yeah, well, again, we obey governing authorities, and we can obey them for the most part. But if they become nakedly despotic or unjust, or if they say, look, we're going to round up and arrest all the Catholics, I think we can switch from Romans 13 mode to Revelation 13 mode, and then do proportionate means of civil disobedience. So again, as a number of people have said, ranging from, I think, beginning with Polycarp all the way through to Calvin, that the obedience we offer to the government is never unqualified, it's never absolute. It's conditional on good governance. And sometimes the way to, for us in a democracy, the way to get rid of the government is how we vote, or how we donate, or we campaign, or we can write an op-ed for the Toronto Star, or whatever it is. There are ways where you can resist, critique, and expel a bad government or a less than ideal government. But if that government is maintaining its power in unjust and tyrannical ways, then you escalate to the proportionate response that will get rid of that government.
Who exactly responds? In terms of that, you respond proportionately. Who responds?
Well, it can be the general people who are governed. The people who are governed are entitled to resist bad government, whether that's at the ballot box, whether that's in civil protest, or, if so required, civil disobedience. So the question is, should the church be involved in that? Mm-hmm. And this is where I've seen, and this is a real debate in different places in the world. Like in Hong Kong at the moment, there are a number of churches who say, look, we're just going to stick to spiritual things. We're just going to meet on Sunday. We will register ourselves with the state authorities. We won't do any sermons. We won't preach on Revelation and the book of Daniel because actually they're banned. You're banned from preaching on Daniel or Revelation. There's an app when you go to church. You've got to fill out an app. You've got to go to an app saying I'm attending worship services today. There's all these things. We'll play the game because as long as we're allowed to sing, 10,000 Reasons 10,000 times every Sunday, like good Christian men and women, as long as we're allowed to do that and say the Lord's Prayer, we're fine, we'll go with it. So some Christians have just in Hong Kong said we're going to be apolitical because we're just going to live under the radar. Okay, we'll just go along with it and we'll be fine. And then you get other Christians, and I think there's a very good book that just came out called Faithful Disobedience by a Chinese pastor called Wang Yi. I really do recommend it. And he's thinking about political theology. He's thinking about Romans 13, but he's writing it. He's writing on Romans 13 not from a Roman. Sorry, I'm still stuck in the first century. He's writing on Romans 13 from a Chinese prison, and as you can imagine, that's a little bit slightly different view, isn't it? There's a little bit different view perspective when you're writing on church-state relationships when the state has put you in prison because you refuse to register your church with them. So this is debate: do church leaders then get involved? Historically, they have. It was the churches that led the Christmas Revolution in Romania, the Velvet Revolution in the Czech Republic, the Solidarity movement in Poland. Christians, sometimes it's our job to be. I know you don't have priests, but we've got to be that. Where that dictator or that king says, "Who will rid me of that meddlesome priest?" Sometimes you've got to be the priest. You've got to be that meddlesome guy that keeps the dictator awake at night. And Christian leaders have historically taken that role, but some, for a variety of reasons, are very allergic to it. Which at one level you can understand because, so in many ways, survival is its own form of defiance. And survival can be its own form of defiance. And you can say, look, this dictator, his lifespan is limited. He'll be dead one day. We just got to play the long game, stay under the radar, and wait for better things to come. Others would say, no, we have solidarity. We are here among the people. We are the church for the people. We have to stand with the persecuted, the marginalized. We need to speak against those who are locked up. So, yeah, those are the, and you can feel the pull of both sides. There's both sides, but you just have to discern within the precincts of your own conscience. What do you believe God is calling to do? To live under the radar, or to be the meddlesome priest?
Mm-hmm.
Me, I tend to be the meddlesome priest side.
Sure.
Because I just like to meddle. Even when the government's good, I like to meddle.
I just have a hard time imagining evangelicals in North America pulling enough togetherness to make something positive like that happen.
Well, actually,
there's no mechanisms.
Yeah, I would say during the Cold War, evangelicals and even mainline church, well, maybe less on the mainline, but evangelicals and mainstream Christianity was fairly united against the communist threat. So I would say that was an example where the churches were. The problem is it is now, certainly in North America, maybe not so much in Canada, but certainly in the US, evangelical is now politically fragmented in 5 different directions. And the word evangelical has now become so broad as to be practically meaningless, and can often just mean people who are white and vaguely Protestant, which is not what I mean. I mean people who cling to the gospel because it brings them towards Christ. That's what I mean by. I still like the word evangelical because historically, globally, it's got a good meaning. I don't want to let Fox News or CNN define what the word evangelical means, and I'm kind of committed because I wrote a book called Evangelical Theology, so I'm stuck, and I could rename it Reformational Missional Catholicism for the 21st century, but that's a publicity nightmare. So I've said, look, I believe in the evangel. I believe in the historic movement, evangelicalism, and you can prize the word from my cold, dead hands.